Welcome to EPG Pathshala, a lecture series for MArch students. Today I am going to talk about suburbanization and how suburbanization impacted Europe and US, and we will try and draw some inferences with respect to our own country, India. So let's see what we have. So after industrialization happened in Europe, London was the leading city where it all happened, where it all started. London was the seat of the British Empire, the seat of Queen Victoria, a very, very Victorian city with its luxurious apartments, its luxurious people, its sort of very rich high class. But then a whole lot of people emigrated inside London to look for job opportunities, to look for work, in hope for better life, not just from Britain but also from various parts of Europe. So this particular excerpt is from John Ruskin. The great cities of the earth have become loathsome centers of fornication and covetousness, the smoke of their sin going up into the face of heaven like the furnace of Sodom, and the pollution of it rotting and raging the bones and the souls of the peasant people round them, as if they were each a volcano whose ashes broke out in the blains upon man and upon beast. This particular excerpt sort of summarizes what slum cities of 19th centuries were, and the slum cities didn't only exist in UK or Britain. It existed in all parts of Europe, including France. Paris was the center of development over there, and in United States pertaining to New York. There was definitely a rapid growth in the city population due to industrialization. People were looking for job opportunities, people were looking for a better life, and probably they got a better life when you compare to their life in the rural parts of the country. And it led to development of slums because there were no housing capacity in those cities to sort of cater for those people. The phenomenon was sort of universal in industrial cities across Europe and in America in the late 19th century and early part of the 20th century. This particular image on the right side shows what kind of crowd was there in the industrial cities. This is Cheapside with Bow Church in background, and it was the financial center at that point in time in London, and it attracted people from all over the world in sort of search of trade opportunities and better financial opportunities. This particular table on the right side shows the population explosion that happened in some of the cities in England during the Industrial Revolution time, wherein you can see almost a 10-fold increase in the population of these cities, the leading industrial cities of Britain. Manchester, Leeds, Birmingham, Sheffield. At that point in time, London's population during the late 19th century was around 5.6 million people, which is a lot of people for a city which was just previously a medieval city, not such a large city with large wide roads or anything of that sort. Now these are few examples that I have put together for you to realize what kind of slums existed at that point in time. The image on the right side shows a sketch by Gustave Doré, who had documented London slum during that time using his sketches, and they are very powerful sketches because they show the poverty, the living conditions in that time very succinctly. On the left side is an image coming from London Hospital Museum, because London Hospital at that time was dealing with a lot of sick children coming from the slums, and they were sick because there were no sanitation in those slums. A few more images to sort of bring home the point. On the left side is another picture of the London slum, wherein you can see the kind of garbage accumulation, the kind of living situations that they have, and the families were not really small families. The families were huge families. That's a single family having probably, I think, 8 children. So that was the normal family size. And if you would think about what kind of room accommodation they had half a room to a whole family, and half a room means really small cramped spaces. And this is the kind of slum environment that London had at that point in time. and so did rest of the Europe. I have only taken example from Paris. Now this series of photographs is by Charles Marville, who documented Paris just before the Haussmannization or the urban design changes brought in by Baron Haussmann took place in Paris, wherein he sort of destroyed all the slums or the small tenements that existed of the poor people and built those huge avenues that Paris is so famous for. And so was New York affected in a similar way, like London and Paris, like any other big city at that point in time. Now these couple of pictures show, on the left side, for example, showing an Italian immigrant worker in New York. Now these are the living conditions in New York as well. On the right side shows it now within the community of the slums, there were small diasporas of various immigrants, say from Italy or say from Poland. So they had their own communities that existed within these slums. Now these couple of pictures show you the Italian kind of immigrants in New York. And also the next image actually shows you the street children which are trying to warm themselves up from the smoke that's coming out from that chimney that's down, and trying to sleep. So this is the images that sort of disturbs one when we look at the slum city, the kind of conditions that existed in Europe and USA at that point in time. And we as a country are no different actually. These slides actually show you what kind of conditions exist. Now this is an image of a trash collector who is collecting trash, and we can actually see our own country's reflection into these kind of images, because we have the similar kind of situation now, and starting late 20th century. Our suburbanization didn't start till the late 20th century, but the suburbanization in Europe and US is where we took our examples from, and we mostly followed the US example. I will be talking about the differences between what happened in Europe vis-a-vis what happened in US in terms of suburbanization. But let's look at some of the other pictures that I have for you. These are the tenements at Park Avenue in New York City. Now this is around 1900, the early 1900s, and you can see the kind of housing they had. Now next image also shows you something similar. This is actually sort of a sketch drawn by William A. Rogers, who sort of documented what happened in New York tenements at that point in time using sketches. And this is probably one of the worst ones that he had, wherein you can see the kind of dirt and dust and the kind of small spaces that people had to live. So summing up the conditions in slum city of 19th century, I can say that there was extreme poverty, there was crime, there was incest, there was all kind of issues happening during that time in London, in New York, and in various big cities which are industrialized at that point in time. And there was no running away from that condition. There was disease, there was no sanitation, there was a whole lot of lack of proper good hygienic living spaces. But the people still continue to flock into these places because of the job opportunities, because of the life it afforded to them, and in some ways that life might have been better from what they had in the rural areas. So that's why the whole exodus from the rural to the urban took place at that point in time. I would say it's probably the hope of a better life that drew them there. The picture on the right side, this one shows the 5 Points slum of New York, which was a center of the crime at that point in New York. So if you watched the movie Gangs of New York, you'll probably know what I'm talking about. So yeah, all of this, the industrialization, not just led to the slum creation, it also led to a whole lot of pollution issues. And London, more often than not, was covered with smog, the smoke from the industries, and due to the foggy conditions, the smog, it sort of changes into smog and used to deposit everywhere on all surfaces, and it was really hard to sort of get rid of. And this particular letter sort of summarizes what smog conditions would have felt like. How long, oh how long, will the people of London continue to endure the murkiness and gloom of its winter months? It is probably happening in winter more. The fogs that turn daylight into darkness worse than night, and the dirt which penetrates into all houses and covers the rooms with a film of sticky filth, which only ardours and continuous labour can remove. So this is what we are talking about in terms of the conditions. And at that point in time, the other countries like New Zealand, they were looking for cheap labor, and they were putting these advertisements in the local newspapers in London to sort of look for a better life again into New Zealand. And the excerpt from on the left side, I remember nothing but evil, painful, festering sores all over my body, mosquito bites, bed bugs, intense cold, and the hunger, and the never-ending hunger, is what the population had to endure, or was enduring at that point in time. And obviously they were looking for better lives, so these adverts helped, and a whole lot of people did emigrate to New Zealand in search for a better life, and New Zealand needed cheap labor to sort of work as house workers and home helps and all of that. At this point in time, there were a lot of recording of what is, in terms of writing, what is happening in those slum areas in London as well as in New York, but nothing before these two texts came up, one in London and one in New York, that anything actually changed. So the first text is The Bitter Cry of Outcast London, which was written by a clergyman called Andrew Mearns. Now he wrote about the slum conditions in London East End, and he went door to door, and his account was not just succinct, it was also sensational, because it documented bit by bit the kind of issues that were there, including poverty, including hunger, including prostitution, including incest, including everything that was rampant, the crimes that were rampant in those areas. Since he was a clergyman, he was probably more worried about people not coming to church from those parts, but the text itself sort of highlighted the poverty so much that it came into attention of some of the leading newspapers, and that's how the whole revolution towards understanding what's happening in these slums started, and the government started to notice, oh, there are these people who sort of live in these conditions, and something can be or should be done about them. Similarly, in 1890, just after 7 years of Bitter Cry of Outcast London, another powerful text came out in New York, which was called How the Other Half Lives. It's a text by Jacob Riis, but by that time cameras were discovered or invented, so he is able to picture, he is able to photograph those images, and that sort of was revealing for a lot of people, because a lot of people didn't know what's happening in these tenements, in these slums, in these places where those poor people live who work as industrial workers. So just two excerpts from the books, which if you will see are very similar in terms of what they relate to. The first one is from Andrew Mearns's The Bitter Cry of Outcast London. So we go in at a doorway and find a little girl, 12 years old. Where is your mother? In a madhouse. How long has she been there? 15 months. Who looks after you? The child who's sitting at an old table making matchboxes replies, I look after my little brother and sisters as well as I can. So this is one of the excerpts from the Andrew Mearns' Bitter Cry of Outcast London, and if I am able to sort of bring out what he wanted to say and what he said, and what sort of maybe started the whole idea of housing issues in London, was these kind of lines which were very, very heart-wrenching. Okay. The second one is a text from How the Other Half Lives. Long ago it was said that one half of the world does not know how the other half lives. That was true then. It did not know because it did not care. The half that was on top cared little for the struggles and less for the fate of those who were underneath, as long as it was able to hold them there and keep its own seat. There came a time when the discomfort and consequent upheaval so violent that it was no longer an easy thing to do, and the upper half fell to inquiring what was the matter. So both the texts brought into light the issues, and brought into light in a way that lot of people came to know, not just the people who were in the government, but ordinary folks who were living in their own cocoons, in their own shells of a luxurious life, sort of came to know what's happening there, and that changed a lot of things. Now, what it did for London was that Charles Booth, he was a ship owner in Liverpool, and he was moved by the bitter cry of outcast London, and he wanted to see for himself whether what's written is true or not. As I mentioned, it was a sensational account, so he just wanted to make sure what's written is true or not. So he went into the East End and started something which we can actually call as a first social survey of first modern social survey of the slum conditions. He drew up a whole poverty map of London, wherein he marked the black areas for the lowest class, which were probably earning 4 cents a day, and right up to yellow, which were upper middle and upper classes, which were wealthy. Okay, and in the whole map, these areas are colored, coded, and you can actually look at what the condition of poverty was in various areas. Now, this particular excerpt of the map shows the Whitechapel area, which was at that point quite famous or infamous for the serial killer Jack the Ripper's activities, where he was actually killing all the prostitutes around that place. So one can realize what kind of conditions there were and what was happening. But Charles Booth's map sort of put it into a picture of what exactly poverty looked like, which has never happened before. So it looked like these black marks, these black dots on the landscape of London, which were not very pleasant to look at, and there were far too many of them. The next thing that Charles Booth did was sort of published a paper called The Improved Means of Locomotion as a first step towards the cure of the housing difficulties of London in 1901. And that sort of brought into light what transportation can do in terms of changing the housing demand or housing conditions. Just to sum up, the slum city sort of happened because there was lack of housing to start with. There was lack of infrastructure to start with, obviously, and there were far too many people, and there were industries, there were job opportunities. So what should be or could be done at that situation was the question posed to the authorities, to the government, to the people of these cities. And these were not the only issues. So the first planning conference as such, the Urban Planning Conference, took place in 1898. And you would imagine that people would discuss about housing, about land use, economic development, infrastructure. But contrary to this belief, people actually discussed horse manure, because of the simple reason that there were too many horses running these cities. Now, as of now, there are only horses, right? There are no automobiles, there are no electric engines, there are no steam engines, there is nothing else. How do you transport? And transport is required because the city has expanded, and city needs that kind of transportation to sort of take care of movement, which is happening from one pocket to from the place people live and to the place people work. So these are a few of the statistics. Horses left 2.5 million pounds of manure on streets every single day in New York. And similarly in London, writing in the Times of London in 1894, one writer estimated that in 50 years every street in London would be buried under 9 feet of manure. And this is no joke in terms of how to handle that kind of manure, what to do with it, and how much can you clean it. That resulted in what historians actually call as the Great Horse Manure Crisis of 1894, and that sort of troubled people in terms of what they can do about it. On, for example, this left side, and then the horses didn't just leave behind the manure; they died too, and carcass removal was an issue. So they were left on the streets to sort of decompose so that they are malleable enough to cut off and then be disposed, and that meant diseases, that meant unsanitary conditions, all of the manures and all of the carcasses. This image actually just shows how much of horse traffic was there in streets of London. This is London's Oxford Street in 1890. Yeah, According to the author Lee Jackson, by 1890s, the city's horses produced approximately 1,000 tons of dung a day, and that sort of is hard to manage. But then something changed over this during this time that sort of changed the way people moved. And this is the picture of the last horse streetcar in New York in 1930. So what happened next is what we are going to discuss now in terms of invention, and that invention changed the way our cities are like forever. Okay, and I think you would have guessed what the invention was. It was the automobile, it was the steam engines and electric trams. It was a whole lot of these transportation inventions that changed the way city was, and horse manure was no longer a problem at all, but the rest of it was still a problem. Okay, so this is a very extremely short history of transportation in 1800s, where we see in 1810s there were ferries, there were omnibuses, there were horse streetcars, which were run by the horses. 1830s they had horse railroads, which were again run by the horses, till the 1840s, when the first steam railroads came through, and then the steam trams, and then electric trams, and then motor cars, and then internal combustible engines, and then you know where it went, okay, in terms of transportation, in terms of automobile development. So what happened to the cities when this happened, when the automobile came, or when the electric trams came, or the steam engine came? So it sort of happened in two different ways in the two parts of the world that we are talking about today. In London, in 1884, Royal Commission on Housing of Working Class was formulated. They just wanted to do something about the working class after the book came out, after The Bitter Cry of Outcast London and Charles Booth's surveys. Formation of London County Council, which established housing for the working class. Committee to implement the Housing for Working Class Act, which was also formulated during this time. The first suburbs were built in London as worker colonies, which is in stark contrast to what happened in America. In America, how did they take care of the slums, or what were the slums in America? So homes that were previously single family, because there was an outward migration of people who were living in the city center because of the bad conditions of the city centers, there was an outward migration of those people, and they were leaving their homes behind. Those homes were divided into multiple living areas for different people, and they were cramped with people, and this is what formulated the New York City tenements, the infamous tenements. There were new tenements which were also built to accommodate the growing population. The private sector obviously sort of took advantage of the need, and they built the tenements. Tenements regulations were there, but not very strictly and hard-fastedly implemented. So private sector did take a lot of advantage in terms of building those tenements. There were basic issues in terms of light, in terms of sizes, in terms of open spaces, in terms of serviceable, hygienic places in those tenements. So although in 1901 the city's officials passed the Tenement House Law, which effectively mandated improved sanitary conditions, fire escapes, access to light, really didn't happen for a very long time. The conditions in tenements still remain the same. If we try and draw an example from our own country, I could actually say that our rapid suburbanization has started only in the late 1900s, and we could actually compare it with the way US has gone in terms of the middle class, or the middle class moving out from the city center and going to the suburbs, which is similar stuff happened in America. The middle class actually moved out. The poorest of the poor, because they had no money even for transportation, they still stayed close to the city center where jobs were. And the rich, because they were too rich and the property prices were still very high, they stayed there in their own houses in the city center. So this is something similar which we can actually compare with what happened in most cities in the US. So the first suburbs that happened in the United Kingdom, in Britain, were based on the mass transit system, and as I have mentioned before, the London County Council was formulated, and they sort of started their own tram system, the electric tram system, the LCC tram. And wherever the LCC tram went, they could actually place a new colony, a new housing colony there. So they rehabilitated some slums. They also created some new ones, new housing projects, which were the first suburbs of London, which were based on the route of the LCC trams. And then after the London Central Railway came up, they also based their suburbs, or the first housing colonies, which can be called suburbs, based on that central railway line. So basically what happened in London was the movement of the people happened along the LCC tram and the central London railway. But also because LCC had no control over the central railway operations and the fares, Central Railway still remained expensive for a lot of people, but LCC trams, they could control the fare, so they kept the worker fare low at the mornings and at the evenings, and they could actually bring down the cost of living in an LCC suburb just outside London, serviced by the LCC tram, lower than what it was in central London. But again, what they experienced was an exodus of the middle slum class, I would say. But the poorest of poor still remained, as I said before, within the city center, because they still couldn't afford the LCC tram. But the people who moved experienced a whole lot of difference in the quality of life that they had in these first suburbs. The first example I could actually talk about is Totterdown Field State in Tooting. Now this was basically a row housing, as you can see from the plan. It's not got any sort of a designer character to it, but then it was clean, it had open spaces, it had wide roads, it was hygienic, and it had good houses. And the houses, the architects of the LCC were sort of influenced by William Morris and the whole idea of having a beautiful sort of a city. So they created nice beautiful houses, and they created them in row because they wanted to optimize the land they had. Obviously there were contradictions to that fact as well, but later on they could experiment a little more, and they went after what Unwin and Parker had done and the garden city concepts. So they designed more organic kind of plans, where this, for example, this one you can see in Tottenham, 1904 to 1928, you can see that they are experimenting with the suburban form, with the urban form of the suburbs, and the differences were very obvious in terms of planning. It was not just a row, it had cul-de-sacs, it has bent sort of roads which offered new views, and it was different from the initial thing that they started with, and it sort of grew from there. These were the first suburbs in London. So what happened in United States was a little different from what happened in London. The first suburbs were still formulated along the lines of the railways and of the subway. And this is what it meant for New York City in terms of this particular ad, for example, shows you what the subway means to New York City with its 15 minutes to Harlem trains, and that's sort of the connectivity that they wanted to establish in the city, and it changed the way people lived. And also this is another sort of plan of the Interborough Rapid Transit Company system, and it shows the lines, and it shows how the city was spread out. And to be honest, all the cities have expanded in one way or the other along the transportation routes, be it railway, be it streets or roads, be it arterial roads, but every city has expanded along those lines, and these cities were no different. Now this is an example from Knox and Pinch's Urban Social Geography, where they have talked about how Chicago has sort of expanded over a period of time. So in the first diagram in the 1850, you see the industrial city, which has a city center, and which has sort of a middle class suburb, okay, and the working class community are still living within the city center. And then you see the growth happening in the next diagram, which is in 1945 to 1975, which is again the industrial city, and how city has expanded in terms of growth along the transportation routes, along the arterial roads, along the railway lines, and you can see the kind of suburbs that are coming up. Now, if you notice the difference between what has happened in London and what has happened here, you will realize that the high class people are moving out from the city, and they are creating their own communities in outskirts of the city, and sort of creating their own spaces to live in, which are high class, which are posh, which are luxurious. And middle class, still they are expanding their suburbs, but they still stay close to the city center. They don't go really far away. And if you look at the post-industrial city, which is the last picture on your left side, which is showing you shopping centers. There are industrial suburbs, there are large shopping centers, there are edge cities which have developed over a period of time in the lines of maybe the garden cities or the beautiful, suburban areas. And there are gated communities, which has something similar has happened to our own cities if you look at it in broad terms. Now, as I said before, in the US it happened a little differently. So what exactly happened is that the rich people were moving out from the city centers, leaving the city centers for the poor and the middle class, and they were creating their own communities. For example, this one is called the Riverside in Illinois, in Chicago, and it was in the tradition of the Parks movement. And this is a community which is designed to be a beautiful posh community with a lot of green spaces and areas, and you can see a lot of famous architects work over there. For example, the one on the left side is the Coonley House by Frank Lloyd Wright, and the community was basically meant to be for because of it being a developed community, a highly designed community. It was for a little bit richer people, and that's who moved out into them. And similarly, I'm sure you all know about Beverly Hills. This was by Wilbur David Cook, and again a similar kind of thing. And the blacks or the immigrant population was not really allowed to own any property over here, and it was mainly for the people, white people. And that sort of separated what happened in the Britain and in United States. And fortunately for us, or unfortunately for us, we have sort of followed the US traditions, and our suburbs have grown into these gated communities, and which are really not self-sustaining as such. People still depend a whole lot on commuting to their workplaces. There is no work in those communities, but they live in those communities. They are a shell in their own, they are a cocoon in their own. So this is where I end today, and I will continue in the next talk on what happens next. Thank you.